$5.7 billion. That is not a forecast. That is not a political estimate. That is money already gone. In 2025, the United States tourism industry lost $5.7 billion because one group of people quietly stopped showing up. Not because flights were expensive, not because hotels were full, not because of a recession, but because millions of Canadians decided they were done rewarding disrespect. For over a year, Donald Trump spoke about Canada not as a partner, not even as a rival, but as something smaller, something temporary, something that could be absorbed, mocked, or threatened without consequence. He talked openly about annexation. He framed trade disputes as loyalty tests. He treated the relationship as leverage, not trust. And Canadians responded in the only way that required no government approval, no protests, and no laws. They stayed home, or they went somewhere else. The result was one of the fastest tourism pullbacks in modern North American history. Ski towns across the northern United States saw their winter seasons collapse. Border cities that had depended on Canadian visitors for decades suddenly went quiet. Hotels, restaurants, campgrounds, and duty-free shops watched their most reliable customers disappear. This wasn't organized by Ottawa. There were no official travel bans, no boycotts declared on television. This was 20 million people, one decision at a time, choosing not to cross the border. And the damage spread faster than Washington expected. According to the United States Travel Association, international tourism spending in 2025 fell sharply compared to the previous year. The decline was driven overwhelmingly by one group, Canadians. They make up the largest share of foreign visitors to the United States, nearly one-third of all international travelers, over $20 billion in annual spending, a constant, predictable flow of money that many American communities had built their entire local economies around. In 2025, that flow slowed to a trickle. Statistics Canada data showed Canadian return trips to the United States falling by nearly a quarter for air travel and almost one-third for land crossings. Road trips dropped even faster. Some months saw declines approaching 40%. This was not seasonal noise. It was sustained, and it kept getting worse month after month. By late summer, border crossings were down nearly 20% nationwide. In some regions, the decline was closer to 30%. For businesses that operate on thin margins, that kind of drop is not survivable. Tourism researchers began surveying Canadians directly, and the answers were remarkably consistent. A majority said they were deliberately avoiding travel to the United States because of political rhetoric, trade tensions, and the feeling that they were no longer welcome. More than a third had already canceled trips they had planned months in advance. Many said they had no intention of returning while the current political climate remained unchanged. This was not indecision. It was choice, and the consequences became visible almost immediately. In New England, state campgrounds that normally fill by early summer sat half empty. Hotels that usually sell out during peak weekends reported entire floors unused. Restaurant owners described evenings where tables stayed vacant even during holiday periods. In Maine, small coastal towns reported their worst tourism year on record, worse than the pandemic, worse than financial crises. Businesses that had survived lockdowns could not survive silence. In Montana, where Canadian travelers account for the majority of international tourism, border crossings fell sharply. Hotels lost group bookings. Sports teams canceled entire events. Credit card data showed spending collapsing by nearly 40% in some towns. For communities that had relied on Canadian visitors for generations, the absence was existential. Florida felt it too. Canadians have long been the backbone of winter tourism there. Snowbirds who return year after year, rent the same condos, eat at the same restaurants, and quietly inject billions into local economies. In 2025, visitor numbers dropped by nearly 20%. Real estate agents reported Canadian owners selling properties they had held for decades. Not because of price, because of atmosphere. Even destinations far from the border were affected. Hawaii saw Canadian arrivals decline significantly compared to both the previous year and pre-pandemic levels. Restaurants noticed the difference immediately. Entire customer segments vanished. This wasn't a temporary downturn. It was a behavioral shift. And behind the statistics were stories that made the change impossible to ignore. A Vancouver professional who used to visit Hawaii multiple times a year canceled every trip. Not postponed. Canceled. She gave up deposits and stopped looking at property purchases entirely. A British Columbia family forfeited thousands of dollars to cancel a desert vacation rather than spend their money in the United States. A longtime Florida winter visitor from Ontario ended a 20-year tradition and said he had no intention of returning. Tour operators confirmed what businesses were seeing. Entire U.S. tour packages collapsed as customers backed out. Companies that once specialized in American destinations pivoted away almost overnight. Canadians weren't angry in the loud sense. They weren't shouting. They weren't protesting. They were redirecting. Mexico, Costa Rica, Southern Europe, and Caribbean destinations saw increased Canadian bookings. Even Cuba, a country under U.S. sanctions, became a preferred alternative. Not because it was closer or cheaper, but because it felt politically neutral. Many Canadians simply traveled within Canada instead. Provincial tourism agencies noticed the shift and moved quickly. Advertising budgets were increased. Domestic travel campaigns expanded. Money that once flowed south stayed home. This internal redirection softened the impact for Canada while deepening it for the United States. The effects were so severe that border-dependent businesses began cutting staff dramatically. Duty-free shops reported sales collapses of up to 80%. Employees were laid off. Hours were reduced. Locations that once employed dozens operated with skeleton crews. At that point, Washington could no longer pretend this was a coincidence. Congressional committees began compiling reports. State by state, industry by industry, testimonies from business owners filled the pages. The conclusion was blunt. American communities were paying the price for political hostility that they had no control over. Senators from affected states traveled to Ottawa, not to negotiate tariffs, not to threaten retaliation, but to listen, to explain, to ask whether the damage could be reversed. Tourism boards launched emergency campaigns, discounts, welcome messages, special passes just for Canadians. Cities hung banners saying they missed them. Las Vegas offered week-long promotions. Palm Springs declared its affection publicly. California rolled out a statewide effort to bring Canadians back. None of it worked, because this was never about price. It was about respect. You cannot offer a discount large enough to erase the memory of being told your country should not exist. You cannot market your way out of humiliation, and you cannot rebuild trust with a coupon. Even industry leaders admitted the problem openly. A 10% decline in Canadian tourism alone translates into billions in lost spending and tens of thousands of jobs at risk. The actual decline was far worse than 10%. Economists warned that tourism behaves differently than other industries. Once habits change, they do not automatically revert. Travelers who discover new destinations, form new routines, and build new emotional connections do not simply return because political leadership changes. A Canadian family that spent 2025 discovering Costa Rica does not forget that experience. A retiree who enjoyed winters in Europe does not feel urgency to go back to Florida. Young Canadians who would have grown up visiting the United States are building travel traditions that exclude it entirely. That is future revenue lost not just this year, but for decades. The most dangerous part of the boycott is not the immediate loss. It is the signal it sends. For generations, Canadians viewed the United States as predictable, stable, and fundamentally respectful, even during disagreements. That assumption has been shattered. And when trust breaks, it does not return automatically. Donald Trump assumed that economic power meant freedom from consequences, that allies would complain but comply, that proximity meant dependence. The Canadian tourism pullback proved otherwise. Without laws, without coordination, without confrontation, 20 million individuals exercised economic choice. They didn't blockade borders. They didn't chant slogans. They just didn't come. And the largest tourism economy in the world felt it. $5.7 billion is only the opening chapter. The deeper cost is reputational, the realization that influence cannot be forced, that goodwill, once lost, must be earned slowly, and that even a superpower can be punished quietly when it mistakes dominance for respect. This was not a boycott driven by rage. It was discipline. And the United States is still learning what that costs.